Our first topic is going to be on how did you guys get started, right? Sounds basic, but we know that there is a lot of legwork that goes into actually getting the application, actually winning the application and getting a license. And then you actually have to build the facility, right? And there's tons of capital involved. There's all these crazy machines. Some of them I understand. Some of them, they look like Bill Nye's contraptions. So that's where we want to start, okay? So you guys had an idea and a dream. You saw an opportunity. Can you walk us through how you took that from an idea, let's just say up to a winning application? Then we'll get to construction. Why don't you start us off, Lo?
Oh, sure. Well, I will say that Washington's license process is a little bit simpler than some other states, especially limited license states. So I have experience in helping other people with applications, but in Seattle, I had to actually buy a license that was already established. I'm sure Nichole was um, a different process, but I came in a little bit later. And so in Washington, you have to find a license that's already been granted and then buy that license. So I found myself in a unique and really opportune situation to get my license for Halo. But I also went through about a 4-year process in Ohio with my family getting started there. And that license process was brutal. I mean, it takes your entire self and multiple team members with a wide range of experience to be able to write an application that is hefty enough, robust enough, and calling out every single rule while also not just reciting the rule. So there's so much that goes into writing a solid application for states like Ohio or Illinois, for example. And so it actually costs a lot to even write the application and file applications in those states. And then on top of that, in many states, if you are not on top of the scoring process, I've heard many times over, including our own application, getting misscored. And we had to go back and basically prove that we had the right answers in there. And so it's a multi-year process. And so it's a tough one for people, especially if you're seeking investment, because it's something that is a little bit uncertain and also takes a long time to even get started. And so it's extremely complicated, but I'm grateful that Seattle was a little bit simpler. And so I'll let Nichole take a little bit more detail in terms of the Washington state license process.
Yeah, we actually had a much different process because we were one of the ground floor applicants. So it was that tricky point where you need to show that you have all of your capital secured for your first, I think it was your first 2 years of operating expenses or something. But in order to show that capital, your investors want to see a license in hand, right? They don't want to invest in something that you can't show them. And the other piece of that was we had to have a location to do business. We had to be leaseholders or property owners before they would grant us the license. But again, trying to find a landlord who's going to let you do business in an as yet still illegal industry on site and undertake that risk with things being federally illegal was super challenging. So for us, it was definitely making relationships at the city and county level, learning your zoning restrictions inside and out. So when things come up that are bigger than you, you've got an answer ready. And making friends there who can give you just straight non-cannabis answers to problems. I think that was the biggest thing, was like demystifying the application by taking the cannabis piece out of it and trying to treat it like any other business application would be. And that's sort of the best piece of advice I have, is just take it piece by piece and calmly, and set yourself aside enough working capital so that you don't stress out about the fact that it's taking a year when it should have only taken 4 months, and it's going to take exponentially longer than you think it's going to, and just plan on that so you don't have to stress about it.
Did you guys work with a lawyer with your application, or a cannabis applicant group at all? Or was this kind of, you guys powered through it on your own?
We had 2 attorneys. We had 2 sets of attorneys for different issues, but wound up not really involving either of them in the license writing process. But again, because it was early days, we didn't know. We didn't know what would come up. We didn't know if, state and federal were going to have lawsuits that would come up that would try and prevent us, in different municipalities, preventing us from getting licenses within those. So I think it's great to have on reserve, keep an attorney on retainer, but we wound up not using ours. And we wrote the application ourselves. We didn't use any consultants, because again, at the time, there wasn't really anyone.
Yeah, we actually did end up working with a consulting group for our Ohio application because of how many aspects we had to cover, that we needed to be absolutely sure we could handle the whole application. And so we did lean on a consulting group, and also absolutely recommend having an attorney that is either already experienced in the cannabis space or willing to put in the work it takes to dissect the rules and regulations. And Nichole mentioned creating a network, or having friends and creating relationships throughout different aspects of the industry, on top of the zoning and local and state regulators, because at any moment in time, the regulations can change, or they'll add something to the application that you need to change or add on at any point. So I find that having the network and groups like On the Revel, like having a community that you can reach out to and ask these questions to, or can give you a notice about potential changes down the line, is vital for being able to keep up.
Definitely. And when you're seeking help from people in other states too, making sure they're well versed in operating outside of their own state. I know a lot of times I'll get unsolicited advice from California friends being like, oh, you should just, I'm like, yes, no, I would love to just do that, but that's not a Washington thing. So yeah, I think a lot of times we all get very tunnel visioned about how complex our own situations are. And trying to remember to zoom out from that. And that's a big part of like how we started our business from day one, was understanding that there's a lot of uncertainty in each state as they make their decisions, but also trying to keep this long game vision going of, okay, but eventually with federal legalization, we want to be on board with how things are going to eventually go. So down to, why we chose doing CO2 extraction versus the other available methods, because, and I'm sure you're the exact same way. We knew that eventually that's going to be, the path of least resistance for federal legalization. So we wanted to be very well versed in that practice from day one.
I echo everything you just said, and want to emphasize the kind of not necessarily like playing a long game, but really thinking about the future and what that could look like. And there's a lot of different directions it can go into, but creating a business that's going to be able to pivot, and having those future standards in mind as you build your facility, create a brand, choose your solvents, like all of these, even what part of the industry you want to be part of, will help set yourself up for success. Because this, starting a business is hard. Starting a business in cannabis is 20 times harder. And so if you can think ahead and really like understand what the future could hold, it will help you make better decisions right now.
And I think really being strong in who you are as a business and as a collective within your team, and why you're doing what you're doing. If you're just getting in to chase market trends and do it because cannabis is hot right now, you're going to have a really wild ride and like not good. It's a really volatile industry, and there's really harsh lows and really high highs. But if you have, kind of an inner driving ethos that's helping you make these decisions aside from all that noise, I think it really helps you withstand the storm a lot more.
And that
reactive.
And that also applies to like your investors and who you seek support from, because if you are not aligned, then it makes every challenge really hard. So if everybody, you have to, it's a tough process to go through, but you have to be aligned, every single person involved.
Yeah, I think that's a good pivot actually. And I know we're getting there eventually. But like managing investor relations, especially within cannabis, is such a specific thing, because so many people have heard tales of these high returns in the cannabis industry. and getting them to understand that those high returns are in really specific roles within really specific markets. And they don't apply to the industry as a whole, and they don't apply to every state as a whole, and they don't apply to every role within the market. They don't apply to organic farmers. They don't apply to craft extractors. And that's something that we spend a lot of time, fighting for legislatively and, structurally within the industry. But it's something that we try and stay really transparent with our investor team about, because that can be a huge stress component. Is, you set these margins for yourself based on what we think an industry is going to look like. And not only is, it's a new thing, so it's changing, but yeah, every state, as new states come on, pivot to try and adjust their market to catch up with other states, and you get this butterfly effect of runoff to deal with.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that we in New York have a medical cannabis right now, which is actually all solventless. And I don't want to go into the actual types yet. I'm sure we'll get into that. But we have a large audience that is trying to figure out what's their next play going to be. So when you guys were doing that early research, right, you have some tips of like, make sure your investors are all aligned, make sure you get your zoning restrictions. But how are you doing this planning before you got your license? Like, were you looking at research, or were you doing product development on the low? Like, how did you start to plan what you were going to do before you actually had a license? Especially you, Nichole, right? Like, you guys are so early. I don't even know if they had market reports then.
Washington had a medical market, which we were a part of, and which our grower had been a part of for many years. But no, there was no like market research on legal cannabis. There were a lot of projections that were based on nothing. And we based a lot of our projections on like traditional retail markups. Weirdly, actually, our projections were pretty accurate as far as our costs and the cost to consumer. But the one thing that we didn't take into account was the way Washington structured their licenses was we're not allowed to have vertical integration. So they put a limit on the number of retail stores that could exist, not on the number of producers and processors initially. So the retail stores are the ones who control the retail margins. So we had no control over that. And it's just not something we would have seen coming, that a retail markup within this specific industry would be so different than any other traditional retail model. So it really spun our margins much lower. And we wouldn't have known until getting into it. So every year it's, readjustment. But we were definitely doing product research and product development early on, not just based on cannabis at all necessarily, but I do have an herbalism background and doing traditional herbalism extractions, herbal medicine formulations, basing our product, planning on that, and then getting into the extraction process and training on that from the medical market was a really different thing too, because the people who were training us on this equipment had a totally different end goal than we do. They wanted to just maximize yield. They wanted to maximize weight. And that's not what we were interested in at all, which we can get into later. But yeah, it's interesting to, again, like, okay, what are the products we want to make and why? And then troubleshooting how you can do that in a perfect world. And then as you learn more about the regulations that are coming down the pipeline, kind of repivoting as you go.
And while Nichole or someone entering the market like very early on didn't have really the resources that traditional business or traditional industries have today, we are getting there. And I think that there are enough states that are legal and even have been medical for long enough time that you can actually look at those market trends. And I have a colleague who works for Headset Data who gets to see all the back end data, and she is saying how you can literally overlay like the trends from every single state and see how in line the timelines are. So it's just true that each state is its own ecosystem, but it goes through the same timeline in terms of consumer demand and trends and things like that. Now there are like little niche hot trends in each market, but for the most part, like the general trends, like what consumers are buying and what portion of each market is of the market share based on product type, those all will align. And so oh, go ahead, Nicole, you look like
I was just going to say, I do feel like one thing that is really important to keep in mind, though, especially with small business entrepreneurs, is how your initial industry is structured is going to really change how many small businesses are left after the culling that happens. And yes, you know, consumer education absolutely plays a huge role in, as products come online, you know, consumers get savvy and, you know, you'll see trends in actually, you know, buying. But especially in Washington and California, you see these huge culling periods come where small businesses can't survive the consolidation that's coming in without things like, you know, processor cooperatives that can set price floors. So we don't have huge buyouts coming from these big companies as they come in, especially with, again, federal legalization looming and big states looking to small states to, you know, influence how those industries are structured from the ground up. So I think just trying to be as aware as you can as a small business owner of how friendly your particular market is going to be long-term to small businesses.
I love that.
And oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that with all of that in mind, you know, having the data that we have now, you know, using that as kind of like a guideline or validating what you're trying to do. But fundamentally, it comes down to like, how do you want to operate your business? Are you going to be the low margin, high volume product? Because, you know, there's room on the shelf for that. Granted, it is one of the hardest ways you can enter this industry. Or are you?
Sorry, go ahead.
What was that?
Hard and reactive, because you always have to be able to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some people are down to do that, and sure. But what we're finding in terms of sustainability, not, you know, going beyond like what we should be operating sustainably for the earth, but also as businesses, you know, knowing who we are, knowing the audience that we're trying to reach, and you know, holding true to that that vision is really important. And so this is where it comes down to like building your foundation off of that, because that will dictate every decision you go going forward. And so choose your path if it's one or the other, because you know, having to like pivot that far into something is really hard, especially going from a low margin, high volume product to trying to get into craft. It's just a completely different business model.
Well, and banding together with like-minded people, you know, go to
Right.
the licensing workshops, get on the Zoom workshops, not even for the content itself, but to see who else is there and to hear what they're saying and how they're describing their businesses. And if that resonates with you, connect with those people, because you're the foundation of the entire industry within this state, which is going to be the entire region of that industry within the country when things go federal. And these are the people who are not just shaping what products look like, not just shaping what businesses look like, but shaping what regulations look like within that industry. And getting to know one another and getting to, know one another's values and banding together early on so you can actually have a coherent voice, because you'll get steamrolled otherwise by other people who from the beginning, you know, are paying attention to that stuff and making decisions one way or another.
And with that, like, I think I came into this not, this is such a new industry and every state is building their program. And so understanding that your voice actually does matter at this stage and at every stage of growth. Like even every year, our cannabis industry in Washington state comes together and goes to meetings and makes sure that we all understand how we want it to move forward. And we might have differences of opinions, but we at least have the dialogue, and finding the resources to be able to call somebody up and say, hey, you know, am I looking at this right? You know, how do we want this to go? And in other states like Ohio, we're having the same, you know, but you have to foster that type of community and that type of industry, because otherwise it is just the loudest voices that get to control how the program is set up.
Exactly. That's why the program is so crucial. Like what you guys are doing is just unprecedented. And I so wish we had something like this when we were starting to connect us all.
Well, I appreciate it. We're grateful to have expert women paved the way. I want to just comment quickly on well, a ton of things you said, but I'm going to narrow it down. One of which was kind of like the market design and the way that it's set up from the beginning that might be more or less advantageous for small businesses or more equitable. And in YouTube world, 9 months from now, this is probably an irrelevant point, but because it's such a hot topic right now in New York, I just can't stress enough that if this is important to you as people that are watching this, you need to go support the MRTA. We'll add links to this, but the design of the way the infrastructure for how the market works has such great implications on the opportunities that are to everybody else. On that note, I'm going to ask one more question on this, like getting up to speed for your business. And I have to ask it. How did you guys get funding, right? Like getting funding in general is hard. Getting funding for cannabis is extremely hard. Getting funding as women is also especially hard. So I want to understand how you guys have like climbed up this ladder against all the odds. And also you must be crazy to even try it. And also like you guys killed it. Right. So how did you guys get your money? Where did it come from? What are some things we can learn from?
Lo, do you want to go first on this?
Sure. Friends and family. So I like poured my savings into just obtaining the license. And then I worked with friends and family to basically help me with by way of equipment. So there's a really, first of all, I also recommend on top of legal to also work with an accounting firm or somebody who's experienced in like the finance management of a cannabis company, because there are a lot of limitations in terms of taxes for cannabis companies, and that could be a whole series in itself. But having somebody to help you, yeah. Structure your business. How do we structure the business? What assets should be in what companies, and really understanding the structure and how to optimize each asset is really important. And so this is a roundabout way of saying that basically we have the asset of the one company, which is the cannabis company that owns the license, and then another company that owns the equipment. And with that, we've secured the equipment separate from the cannabis company. And then also you're able to get funding a little bit easier because financing equipment is like on the manufacturing side, super, super common. And so if you can kind of create a level of separation from the cannabis company, it does give you access to more opportunities. But for me, fortunately, I was able to go through private financing and basically do it through friends and family, which also created support from that network, because our collective success means the sustainability of this business and that the investors will get their return. So working with the right people with clear expectations in terms of like the timeline of the whole growth of the business, it made the conversations a little bit easier and the terms more favorable.
Yeah, ours was a little bit trickier because in the beginning, the idea of us doing this came from a few people who were involved pretty heavily in the traditional market and in the medical market. And they were looking for a way to get into the recreational market, which seems like a very logical path that now we're talking openly about. But at the time, was really not a favorable path to take. And Washington was really not friendly to traditional market growers getting into the rec world. They wanted to rebrand the image of the cannabis industry. They really didn't want that dirty money coming into their industry, not realizing that like that's the world we've been living in. And if you want to keep it out, it'll stay outside and it'll keep thriving, as we know. So that was what set us up to do this. And then as we got in the process, it became really clear that there wasn't a path forward with that. And we did have, multiple legal teams who we were really transparent with, being like, we're trying to get, a few people above board here and take them with us. And they were just like, they can't come. If you want to have a business, they can't come with you. And so that became the answer. And then we're like, well, shit, pardon my language, but we don't have any money anymore. And it became this crazy hustle of friends and family. And, you know, as we had gotten into it and started the application, and we were like, we really believe in what we're doing. Like, this is what we're trying to do is important. And what the state just did is pretty fucked up and not okay. And we want to create a system that's helping communities, not excluding communities. And so we fought really hard to make that case to a lot of people really quickly, and drum up the funding that we needed just for phase one. We got lucky that, again, with our particular skill set, we were able to do all of our build out ourselves. We were able to really scrap a lot together, really with lower numbers than I really don't understand how we did it. But, yeah, we got very lucky. And again, same thing, we were really transparent with our investors about the kind of business we were trying to create. And if we couldn't do that, then it, you know, there's no point in overpromising and creating a life of stress of under-delivering. That's not why we're doing this, right? We're doing this to live out in the open and be transparent about what we're trying to build. So if you can't do that and you have to, you know, I hear friends in California right now getting really afraid of jumping into bed with these shark investors and, you know, having to like cater that to them, this image that they're hoping to see of an ideal investment. And that is really scary to me. You're setting yourself up to just be beholden to these really unrealistic interests of an investor class that doesn't understand what's going on Earth. So that's my advice, is don't do that.
Well, I appreciate it. We're going to wrap up this section, but what I'm taking away amongst a bunch of bars over here is absolutely know the people that you're working with and build those meaningful relationships, and making sure you guys are seeing eye to eye on the vision. Because if you guys are misaligned there, all of that hard work, all of the effort writing the license, all of your skill sets don't really matter if the business isn't going to be successful. And I think that's like the number one thing I'm taking away from that. Okay,